Hello, and welcome to your Jewish Community Town Hall discussion about anti-Semitism in Canada. My name is Naomi Parnas. I'm the co-founder of KPW Communications and a former reporter for CTV News. I'm very, very pleased to be here tonight for this extremely important discussion. I also am a huge volunteer and play a big role in the Jewish community, so this is a very important topic to me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. I am live in Toronto, Ontario, acknowledging that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, I, like you, am very concerned about the recent rise in anti-Semitism that we've experienced over the last few months. It's been such an upsetting time for all of us, which is why CIJA and tens of thousands of community members like you called on the government to host an emergency summit on anti-Semitism so we could start addressing this problem. The good news, the government listened to our collective voice, and the summit will take place next week. To ensure that your perspective is included, we organized this town hall so you can share your experiences and concerns, which we will relay to our elected representatives. We have solicited questions and comments in writing and by video in advance of tonight's town hall, and I invite you at any time tonight to pose your own questions or comments in the chat box of this webinar. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible, but remember, tonight's discussion is just the beginning. So if we don't respond to all of them tonight, we will be in the coming days and will, of course, relay them to our elected representatives. To help us sort through your questions, we will be joined by an expert panel who will offer their perspective and will also share what they're working on to reduce the troubling rise in Jew hatred here in Canada. We are recording tonight's town hall so that we can share elements of it with the government and so we can share it with members of our community who could not join us tonight. Before I introduce our panelists, please join me in welcoming the Honourable Bardish Shager, Minister of Diversity and Inclusion of Youth of Canada, who is the lead organizer of the summit and who has kindly agreed to join us tonight. Minister Shager.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for that kind introduction and for having me with you tonight. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. And I'm really pleased to be here with you today and with representatives from the Jewish community. Pendant des générations, les communautés juives du Canada sont actives dans tous les secteurs de la société et ont contribué à façonner le Canada qui s'y trouve. L'antisémitisme, qu'il soit dirigé contre les individus ou les institutions communautaires, ne peut être et ne sera pas toléré. For generations, Jewish communities in Canada have been active in all parts of society and helped shape the diversity found within Canada. Anti-Semitism, whether directed against individuals or communal institutions, cannot and will not be tolerated. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said, Canadians understand that diversity is our strength. We know that Canada has succeeded culturally, politically, economically because of our diversity, not in spite of it. Yet we know that a multicultural society, one that is truly open and inclusive, is always a work in progress. It demands our effort, our attention, and our care. And the Government of Canada is not remaining idle in this fight. We have and we will continue to take steps against anti-Semitism. Some of these steps include recognizing with shame that the policy of the Government of Canada between 1935 and 1948 was to close our doors to Jewish refugees. The most well-known example being the infamous MS St. Louis incident of 1939, for which Prime Minister Justin Trudeau offered an apology in 2018. Adopting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism in Canada's anti-racism strategy 2019-2022 to help combat anti-Semitic attitudes and behaviors, including Holocaust denial and distortion, and appointing Canada's first special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism, the Honourable Irwin Cotler, and making the adoption of the implementation of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism a core component of his mandate. And finally, as Naomi mentioned, hosting a national summit on anti-Semitism convened by the Honourable Irwin Cotler and the Anti-Racism Secretariat on July 21st. This summit will bring together a diverse group of community and political leaders, academics, activists, and members with intersectional identities within the Jewish community. Together, participants will continue charting a path forward to combat racism and discrimination. I would like to give a special recognition to CJ for bringing people of the community together tonight for this really important conversation. I want you to know that I will be listening in as well. I will be taking off at a little bit before 8 for another event, but I have members of my team who will continue to participate and listen because it is important that we hear directly from community. And Naomi, you shared a bit about the work that you have done. I really do want to thank you and the numerous community members in the community who have taken active roles to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hate, which are unfortunately still found in Canada. Hate does not belong in Canada, and we as a government are committed to help combat that to ensure that we build an even better and more consciously inclusive Canada. Thank you so much for having me with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Minister Shager. We look forward to hearing more from you and your colleagues at all levels of government during and following the summit. And I know you thanked me, and I have to say that I joined this because I'm, as I said, a very proud member of the Jewish community, but it was an interesting turn of events over the last few months in my own family, where my own children, for the first time, were afraid to put our Walk with Israel sign on the lawn. So this is a very important topic, and I know that you're listening and your staff are listening. And you know, if my own children who are in elementary school are feeling that, then this is something that we definitely need to address. It is now my pleasure to introduce someone who needs little introduction in our community. The Honorable Irwin Cotler is former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, longtime Member of Parliament, international human rights lawyer, and now Canada's Special Envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. He is also the chair of next week's Emergency Summit and joins us from Jerusalem, Professor Irwin Cotler.
Bonjour et bienvenue, et merci pour cette chaleureuse introduction. Thank you for those very kind words. Je suis très heureux de participer dans la cause commune que nous rassemble, la lutte contre la haine, contre l'antisémitisme, and of this struggle against anti-Semitism as being very much the struggle for ourselves, la lutte pour nous-mêmes. Because in what we say, and more importantly in what we do, we make a statement about ourselves as a people. We make a statement about ourselves as people. We are witnessing and have been witnessing for some time an old, new, global, escalating, virulent, sophisticated, and even lethal anti-Semitism, which reached a tipping point in the recent Hamas war against Israel, where Jews are threatened and targeted in their neighborhoods and in the streets, on the campuses and in their communities, where synagogues are torched, memorials are defaced, institutions are vandalized, and cemeteries are desecrated. The whole finding expression in two particularly disturbing empirical data. First, that Jews are the most targeted minority with respect to hate crimes, and where 2020 was the highest level of anti-Semitic hate crimes ever reached, and in 2021, we have already reached the level of 2020 by the end of May 2021, and where we are witnessing at the same time an incendiary anti-Semitic hate in the social media, where, for example, we had in 1 week 17,000 tweets and a variation that Hitler was right. All of which is underpinned, most disturbingly, by a number of dynamics that are not always appreciated. First, the mainstreaming, normalization, and legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture, and the absence of outrage underpinned also by indifference and inaction. Second, the threat of anti-Semitism to our multicultural democracy, as Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, put it, anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies, the canary in the mine shaft of evil. And as we've learned only too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. The globalization phenomenon. The Jews are a global people. What happens in Paris and London, in New York and Florida, hate crimes threatening and targeting of Jews reverberates back in Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. And we have also the marginalization of the struggle against anti-Semitism in the necessary struggle against systemic racism, whether it be racism against Indigenous peoples or Blacks and people of color, or Asian Canadians or Muslims. But in that configuration, somehow the struggle against anti-Semitism gets marginalized. Finally, and not unrelated to is the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of the struggle against racism itself, where Jews are increasingly characterized as being part of the white oppressor class, or Israel is increasingly characterized as being part of the oppressor framework in the whole intersectionality debate. Here too, the demonization of Israel reverberating back to the demonization of the Jew. And I'm not even referring to the extent to which we've seen a revival of the old libels, such as the Jews as the poisoners of the wells, where the very pandemic of COVID-19 is instrumentalized with respect to the pandemic of anti-Semitism, where Jews, the Jewish people, Israel, are accused of both manufacturing the COVID-19 virus, spreading it, profiting from it, and then sometimes even with the Jews being labeled as being the very virus itself. All of which ask us, what then do we do? And this makes the convoking of a national emergency summit as timely as it is necessary. And let me now just share with you, for reasons of time, in a series of one-liners, framework for an action plan. Number one, we need to mandate Holocaust education and the teaching of anti-Semitism in our public as well as in our high schools, as we've learned here too only too well, that the Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, as anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. And you can't understand the Holocaust without understanding the central role of anti-Semitism in it, nor can you understand anti-Semitism without understanding the whole question of the Holocaust. Second, we need to both enhance the adoption and implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, the most authoritative, comprehensive international definition that we have, and one democratically adopted over a 15-year period. But we must mainstream it in the implementation across all sectors of our society. Number three, we need to invoke and implement parliamentary principles and antecedents where Canada has played a distinguishable role, for example, in the adoption of the London Declaration to combat anti-Semitism, the Ottawa Parliamentary Protocol to combat anti-Semitism, and a unanimous resolution adopted by the Canadian Parliament in February 2015, little known, but which established an important principle and precedent here where it called upon the Canadian government to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority in both our domestic and our foreign policy. The importance of combating hate crimes. And when I say combating anti-Semitic hate crimes, I'm referring to using the 4 Ps: the prevention of such hate crimes, the protection of its victims, the prosecution of its perpetrators, and the necessary partnership between federal, provincial, and municipal law enforcement units and the like in that regard. The combating of the incendiary anti-Semitism in the social media, as I mentioned, including holding the social media platforms accountable. A zero tolerance policy for anti-Semitism in any of our political parties, and where political leaders must call out anti-Semitism, not in the other's political party, but in their own, so that anti-Semitism does not become instrumentalized or weaponized as part of political partisanship. We need also to appreciate that Jews alone cannot combat anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism cannot be fought, nor can it be won by Jews acting alone. What we need is a constituency of conscience and of action. And that is the need for and the imperative, therefore, of such an emergency summit to combat anti-Semitism. And finally, and I say this as somebody who is a Canadian, where the UN is part of my DNA, human rights, part of our foreign policy, international law, centerpiece of our identity, we have to combat the laundering of anti-Semitism under the universal public values, whether it is the protective cover of the UN, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, or as I mentioned, the struggle against racism, lest we corrupt these very foundational values of our multicultural democracy itself. So may this summit be not only an opportunity to address anti-Semitism in words, but it must be what it is intended to be, an action summit, where words are translated into action, and not as a one-time thing, but as an ongoing combating of the scourge of anti-Semitism, which affects us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Special Envoy Kotler. Some very upsetting things that he talked about, but also some really incredible mandates. So I'm sure we're going to discuss more of these as we go on tonight. Special Envoy Kotler, you are an esteemed leader, and in our community, we are so grateful for that thoughtful, action-oriented contribution to this important discussion. I would now like to introduce our panelists. All of these individuals are deeply committed to our Jewish community. They bring a variety of experience in dealing with different manifestations of anti-Semitism in their own professional lives. From Hillel, Ontario, Ruth Chittis, Assistant Director at Hillel York. From the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, Noah Schack, Vice President of CEJA in the GTA. Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, and Ita Uden, Vice President of CEJA's office in Quebec. We invited representatives from B'nai B'rith Canada, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Centre, and No Silence on Race, but unfortunately they were unable to join us this evening, but we do appreciate the work they are doing to combat anti-Semitism. Let's jump right into one of our first questions. A reminder, you can submit your own questions into the Q&A in the chat. But right now we're going to take a question from one of the people who submitted it by video.
New forms of anti-Semitism appear quite frequently nowadays. How is Hillel adapting to meet the changing needs of Jewish students on campus?
Okay, Ruth, let's start with you. Tell me a bit about what Hillel Ontario has been doing to support students over the past few difficult months and what your team is planning to do in the fall.
So it's a great question. I would say that given the recent escalation, Hillel has kind of taken a two-pronged approach of both reactive but also proactive ways of dealing with anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric. In a campus space, obviously the conversation has begun to be centered around Israel, but lines are blurred and things can often divulge into anti-Semitic jargon and anti-Semitic talking points. And our job as Hillel is to represent students. And from a reactive standpoint, that means advocate for the inclusion of students in space, Jewish students in spaces that are excluding them. It also means dealing with administration. It means when there are reports of anti-Semitism, first and foremost, we do what students request, but it often involves helping them deal with administration and dealing with professors or student clubs that have said anti-Semitic rhetoric and explain to them why that is in fact anti-Semitic. And from a proactive approach, a lot of our work is also now focused, and what in the fall I hope will be focused, is on having Jewish representation in student government and student politics. Representation is super important when it comes to hearing Jewish voices and having those voices be elevated at the level of government, at the university level. And also it has to do with bridge building. To echo what the Honorable Erin Kotler said, anti-Semitism cannot solely be combated by Jews alone, and bridge building in the form of alliances with other communities on campus, ethnic communities, racial communities, communities of interest. Hillel is at the forefront of building those relationships and advancing Jewish interests in those spaces and being an advocate for our community.
Ita, what role can university administrations do in response to all of this?
So students go to university for an education, for an experience, and certainly not to have to worry about their safety or deal with anti-Semitism on a regular basis. It's incumbent on university administration, presidents to stand up clearly and denounce anti-Semitism on their campuses, deliver strong messages that anti-Semitism is not welcome in the safe space that is campus, to listen to the lived experiences of the students, to enforce policies against hate. Most universities have diversity and inclusion administrators to ensure that those policies are enforced, that student fees aren't abused, and that students receive the support and the framework that ensures them a safe space on campus and the ability to thrive in what are very important years in the journey towards adulthood.
We have to get to our next question, but Ruth, I just want to bring you back for a second. For everyone who's listening, how are students feeling right now about going back in the fall? Like, are you hearing from students who are concerned?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of hesitancy around students about being publicly Jewish on campus, and that fear is very real and felt by a lot of Jewish students, and something that we need to take seriously.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to the next video question.
Hi, my name is Marjorie, and I am a retired teacher. My message to elected representatives is it's time for teachers to keep their personal politics out of schools and for teachers' unions to keep their politics out of schools. There should be strict regulations on keeping schools apolitical and neutral. Thank you.
Well, I know those who follow the news will know there's been a story in Toronto about that recently. Marjorie's concerned about politics in our classrooms. Andrea, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think she's right to be concerned. I don't think that the average teacher has the information or the confidence to deal with the conflict in the Middle East. I think there's a lot of bias, particularly in the unions. So I would say that there should definitely be enforcement of the apolitical stance of teachers. And more importantly, there needs to be a challenge on some of the associated theories that breed anti-Semitism. I would say that parents should be concerned about the rise of teaching of critical race theory, which generally means racism and anti-Semitism will flourish if this is allowed in our schools. And I raise that because I know it's coming. It's being fought in the US in the school system and by parents, by teachers, but many of the folks in the union support it, and I understand it's being seriously considered here, and I think we should be very concerned.
Noah, do you want to add your thoughts? I know Erwin Kotler was talking about, the fact that we need, and it needs to be essential to have Holocaust education in schools. Is that something that you think as well could really help with this? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, look, classrooms are supposed to be nurturing environments, places of learning. This isn't the public square. This is a place where children and youth should be given the tools to develop their critical thinking, not taught to swallow propaganda. And I think, there needs to be more educational resources when it comes to anti-Semitism, including the Holocaust. And this is really key for addressing anti-Semitism, not just in schools, but within broader society. Public opinion research shows that the vast majority of Canadians reject anti-Semitism when they see it. But the challenge is that anti-Semitism is a mutating virus that's constantly taking different forms and infecting different segments of society. It's often easy to identify in other groups that you disagree with, but more difficult to point out when it's within your own circle. And it often gets reduced to its most basic forms. We need an education system that's equipped to understand anti-Semitism as it manifests today in all its different manifestations, so that it can take the steps needed to address it. This includes curriculum developed to equip teachers to understand, identify, and teach about anti-Semitism effectively, like Professor Kotler mentioned, in order to prevent the next generation of Canadians from falling victim to the world's oldest hate, which is corrosive, not just in terms of the place of Jews in society, but to everything we cherish about being Canadians. We also need training for equity, diversity, and inclusion staff at school boards about anti-Semitism to make sure they get it and understand how it's manifesting today, so that they can be effective in doing their jobs and living up to the expectations that government has of these functions within school boards. But I want to underscore, this isn't just about Jewish teachers or Jewish students being victimized, or even just standing up for our community. The history of anti-Semitism clearly shows that what starts with Jews never ends with the Jews. This isn't a Jewish problem, it's a Canadian problem. And we have some tremendous allies within the education system, trustees, administrators, teachers, And it's time for all of us to come together to support them and ensure that our public education system has the tools in place that it needs in order to prevent anti-Semitism from taking root in the next generation, and ensuring that Canada remains a welcoming place for Jews and all other at-risk populations.
Thank you, Noah. We're going to go to a live poll right now. First, everyone who's on right now, make sure that you are signed into the chat module on the right-hand side of the video with your name, accept the terms, and click join. When a poll is active, you will see a vote button show up at the bottom of the chat module. Click the vote button to make your selection from the options that appear. So hopefully you have all done that, and I've given you a chance to do that. Our first question is, are you concerned that Jewish students will be excluded because of their identity when they return to schools and campuses this fall? We're going to give you guys a second to place your votes. It's going to take a few minutes here. What are you hearing, Ruth? Do you think that students are feeling like they're going to be excluded as we're waiting for these answers to come in?
Definitely. I think that that's a real fear among a lot of students. I think they fear being excluded for their Jewish identity. And as a result, it feeds this inclination to be less involved because of that fear. And so we need to get at it now before it's at a place where large swaths of Jewish students don't feel safe on campus.
It's horrible that people are feeling this way right now. And again, hoping everyone here is just placing their poll results, just waiting for those poll results to come in. Maybe while we're waiting for those results to come in, because it is going to take a few, oh, there we go, we just got them. So 83% yes and 15% no are the results from that one. So it's clear that a very clear answer there. We've also heard a lot about rising hate online. That was a huge problem this time around with the conflict in Israel. Here's another video question that we received.
I really hope this summit addresses a very significant concern, which I have, which is around these massive tech platforms, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, where so much hate speech is being spread, so much of the violation of Jewish people and Jewish life is being attacked. And there doesn't seem to be anybody out there holding these massive tech companies to account. There is such a massive pit of hideous information and hateful speech that exists on these platforms that it is just a festering cancer we should not allow to continue. It will rot our very democracy. And I hope that some part of the summit addresses this also. Thank you.
I know she's not alone in those thoughts. A lot of people are very concerned about what's happening on social media and online. Ruth, what's the experience been like for young folks who you've talked to in our community? Have they talked about being demonized on social media? What have you been hearing?
Absolutely. I think it's completely fair to say that there's so much misinformation on social media, and it's so constant that kind of inability to turn off, if you will, because it's such a normalized part of being a millennial and Gen Z is being on these platforms. And that can be really toxic. I've had countless students bring that up. And it's additionally the fact that a lot of folks who are not Jewish seem to feel comfortable speaking to Jewish issues. And the same is not true for other marginalized communities. And that feels very upsetting and problematic.
I know with the last conflict, I spoke to a lot of people who had never really felt what they felt this time around. The hate online, feeling very overwhelmed. They had to get off of social media, had to get off of Twitter. Noah, in April, CEJA hosted a national summit to combat online hate. What came out of that summit, and what can be done to fight against anti-Semitism on social media specifically?
Yeah, Naomi, as you mentioned, we had this summit in April before this massive spike in online hate. This isn't a new phenomenon, but it's taken on a new level of intensity, and it's something we really need to address in a focused and urgent way. We hosted an Actionable Action Summit to combat online hate. It was a great opportunity to bring together some of the leading experts in Canada on the subject, social media companies, advocates, and activists from across the country to come together along with the minister responsible to discuss the issues and some best practices with regard to dealing with online hate. And this helped to shape recommendations and reinforce recommendations that we put forward to the government, along with the Canadian Coalition to Combat Online Hate, which CIJA is leading, which has more than 40 participating organizations and communities adding their voice together collectively to speak as one and say this is an important issue that needs to be dealt with. And coming out of the summit, the government tabled a bill to take a step forward in addressing this issue. And it's a complex issue. If it was a simple one, it would be fixed with the snap of the fingers and we wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. Social media is a crucial platform for people to come together. It's a place of community where we can connect with family and friends across the globe. I don't know how I'd still be in relationship with my brother who lives in Israel without it. We're able to build communities and share our most cherished moments with one another through these platforms. And I think the pandemic has illustrated just how important it can be with the inability to connect person to person. But there's obviously a very negative side to social media, as there is with many products that are beneficial in some ways, but can be very dangerous in others. And all too often, social media is being used to promote hatred, to bully, intimidate, to silence, and also to radicalize people to commit acts of violence. And people are getting sucked into false, twisted narratives that advance hatred of Jewish people. And Canadians need the tools to recognize hate content, fake news, and recruitment techniques, and to understand how their online behavior impacts on at-risk communities like ours. And that's why we've asked the government to embark on a national social media literacy program to educate Canadians on the misuse and abuse of these platforms and to protect vulnerable communities. This sustained campaign would establish a standard of acceptable engagement of social media, would reinforce a code of conduct for the use of social media, and flag behaviors that constitute inappropriate, dangerous, or hateful uses. In parallel, we're also working closely with Jewish organizations around the world, with corporate leaders at all of the social media companies to ensure that they understand the multiple manifestations of anti-Semitism and that they are extra vigilant when it comes to removing the most dangerous content that violates their own standards. Addressing the challenge of hate on social media requires a partnership between government, the social media platforms, and community. And we each have a role to play. It's important that if you encounter hate online, you report it, that if it's something truly heinous, you bring it to an organization's attention like ours so that we can bring it forward to the social media platforms themselves and make sure that they understand that this kind of hate has no place in the communities that they're convening.
Thank you, Noah. You'll see my eyes are darting off camera a lot, and that's because we're waiting for questions that are coming in. So just a reminder to everyone that we're taking these video questions, but please, if you have questions, put them into the chat box so that we can try and answer some of these questions throughout the town hall tonight. So let's go to our next question right now.
My parents came to Canada as refugees after the horrors of the Holocaust. The Nazis exterminated their entire extended family simply because they were Jews. We grew up as a family confident that the virus of Jew hatred would never happen in Canada. We lived amongst our fellow Canadians with no fear of intimidation or bigotry. Now, I am afraid to go out in public wearing any Jewish symbols or to tell anyone that I'm of the Jewish faith. I worry about the anti-Semitism the next generation will face at school, post-secondary education, and the workplace. Something needs to be done. Thank you.
I was born in Canada to immigrant parents who fled Poland to find a safer home and a place where they could prosper in Canada. My parents used to always tell me a Jew must have a passport, updated passport, and you have to know where it is. Why? I used to ask. Because a Jew, unfortunately, our experience has been that you might have to run and run quickly. So you always keep your passport and you keep it handy. Never in my life did I ever think that in my beloved country of Canada, I would have to take that advice so seriously. but recent events of anti-Semitism and unfounded hatred of Jews and Israel, completely unbalanced, has made me make sure that I keep my parents' advice and I keep my passport handy.
This is so sad to hear, and just so very upsetting. Andrea, as a result of rising anti-Semitism, we're witnessing an atmosphere, as we've just heard, of fear and intimidation spread across our community. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, it shouldn't be shocking to me, but it is. It's very hard to hear.
It's very hard to hear, but Sarah and Perry are describing something that is becoming the new normal, unfortunately. And I think we do need to confront it in a number of ways. And recently, the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation did host a webinar on security challenges for the Jewish community. And I know CEJA has done something on a webinar also on security. And I would urge everybody to check these materials out. They're available. There are webinars posted. And we did have experts from the police and from cybersecurity organizations talk about some of the things need to be done. So just to point out a few things. And you, Naomi, gave us a story that I think is very vivid and very real, and that is of your children asking about, a sign on your lawn. My son asked me today why I have an end Jew hatred decal on my car, because it's like having a target, like for, here's what you shoot. The point is that, first of all, we have to stand proudly as Jews. We cannot shrink from this. We cannot hide. We cannot pretend. And yes, wear a kippah on the street. Absolutely. We have to claim the streets. We cannot suddenly go into hiding. That would be a terrible mistake. Secondly, we have to be alert. The security people will tell you to pay attention to where you are and what's going on around you, and we all need to learn this. We also need to know what to do if there is an issue, or you experience something, or you view something, or you see something such as signage that's defaming or destructive, and who do you call? You call the police first. You call one of the Jewish organization that deals with anti-Semitism, B'nai B'rith or CEJA, but you have to deal with it. You cannot turn away. You don't take on an attacker, but you do note what's happening. People need to pay attention. I think that we are very passive as a community in these regards. We often accept some level of anti-Semitism, some disparaging remarks, the shunning on campus. So, several people here have said, people on campus, students might just simply not join something or might be afraid to identify themselves. We have to help overcome that. It's not going to serve us well in the long run. But we have to do more than that. We have to demand everything that Erwin Kotler said tonight. We need an action plan, not a resolution. IHRA is a lovely resolution, but there's been no action plan at any level of government. And if we don't see that, nothing will change. If we don't see organizations really holding their head up and saying, we are part of the solution, we're going to make a change. So let me just summarize by saying one thing that I really want people to know. In Toronto on July 25th, we will have an End Jew Hatred rally at Queen's Park. We want people to come out, not to stay home and say, it doesn't concern me, it's not such a big deal. We have to show that it matters to us. So I'm inviting everybody right now, 2 p.m., Queen's Park, July 25th.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. And I did not take that sign down off my lawn. I spoke to my kids about it and we kept the sign up. So you're right. That's what you have to do. Noah, I want to hear from you next. CEJA actually sent out a release today about incidents in Toronto that were concerning recently with anti-Semitism, someone walking down the street with a swastika. What steps can our elected officials take to ensure Jewish Canadians feel secure in their own communities?
Well, and this incident that you mentioned, Naomi, is disturbing because it shows an escalation of an individual starting by taunting Jews in a park here in Toronto, and within a matter of days, moving from those taunts to a point where he knocked a Jewish man to the ground on the sidewalk and began choking him. And I think that that law enforcement, the police responded very quickly and are taking a very serious approach to this, and we really appreciate that. And I think we have to recognize that police are focused in on this and are an important part of the solution, but they're only one layer. And I think there's a lot that government can do, various levels of government can do in order to help support our community and give us the resources and stand shoulder to shoulder with us in order to stand up to this threat. Successive governments have supported the security infrastructure program, which has grown year over year in terms of resources available to support community institutions. And here in Ontario, the government recently introduced the Safer and Vital Communities program. Both of these programs help ensure that synagogues, schools, community centers have critical security measures in place like fences, locks, and cameras, recognizing that the cost burden of these measures shouldn't just be shouldered by at-risk communities like ours, but that government has a role and responsibility in keeping our communities safe. And that's something that I think is really critical and deeply appreciated, and something to build upon. Complementing this program with a new initiative that provides communities with the capacity to enhance deterrence, empower communities to assume some ownership and responsibility for the protection of communal institutions and those who frequent them, and providing local police with support and assistance. This is a model that's been put in place in countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, South Africa, and to an extent in the United States, where trained volunteers serve as the primary layer of security for communal buildings. They do patrols, they do crowd control and management of community events, provide training and advice to communal institutions about best practices, make sure everybody has those critical skills of situational awareness that Andrea mentioned. These organized initiatives liaise with local law enforcement, support local law enforcement efforts, and provide an established point of access for law enforcement within the community. It's just a seamless integration of empowering communities to stand on their own 2 feet and partner with law enforcement in the most beneficial way possible. And ultimately, this should be something that's sustainable by communities themselves. But of course, to get it started, it does require government support. And I think, that's something that the government can do in a very meaningful way to help provide seed funding to establish a program like this and customize it to a way that's tailored and relevant for the Canadian context. We also need to, and within that context, it's really important that there are designated point people within police departments and intelligence agencies to liaise with the Jewish community to make sure that there's a seamless relay of information with regard to threats, developments, best practices, to make sure that everybody is acting on the best possible information and doing the best possible thing to keep ourselves safe. We also need to rationalize the definition of hate crimes. Even here, sitting in the GTA, there are multiple definitions for what constitutes a hate crime across the broad region. And so police engage with these things in very different ways. And I think it's important that we have sort of a uniform standard. And this is something that police chiefs across Ontario have voiced support for. We also need dedicated hate crime units within all law enforcement services across the country. It's crucial that we have police who understand this particular dynamics of hate crime, can respond in a sensitive way to communities, and can help guide investigations in a way that are attuned to the intricacies of how hate crimes manifest in our society, and to help push back against hate-inspired crime in our cities, in our society. And again, I'm going to keep hitting this refrain over and over. Education is key. It's the most important proactive thing we can do. Training for police, training for Crown prosecutors, the offices of the attorneys general, and the judiciary about what constitutes anti-Semitism, about how it looks today. It's not something from a black and white film from 80 years ago. It's something that is real and current, and people need to, in position on the front lines of the fight against hate, need to be able to recognize it, and what appropriate measures need to be adopted in order to respond to it and ensure that we have not just a place in Canadian society, but a safe place in Canadian society.
Thank you, Noah, very much for that. We have one more question before we move on to the next poll, so let's go to another video question.
My name is Sharon Sealer, and I am very concerned by the amount of hate that is circulating in Canada today. I am Jewish, and of course I'm concerned about anti-Semitism, and I think it's very important that students do know about the Holocaust. But because we live in Canada, I think it's essential we know about Indigenous history. And I think we should learn more about all the peoples who make up Canada. I really am very worried about how polarized our society has become and about the amount of hate that is circulating in our community. And I really think we have to work together as a community to combat this.
Andrea, there seems to be a very big focus on education tonight. The Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation provides Canadians with programs to bridge understanding across ethno-racial and faith communities. So tell us a little bit about what CAEF is working on to educate Canadians on anti-Semitism.
So there's a few things. Let me just put a couple things in perspective. First of all, it isn't enough to teach Holocaust education, which is 4 years of horror in the Jewish history. We have to go further back and teach 1,000 years of positive stories about Jews and Judaism. And most people do not know anything about the Jewish people. And research has shown, and the books have been written most recently, evaluating Holocaust education, and it is not a tool that is going to reduce anti-Semitism by itself. So we should be teaching Jewish history in public schools. Who are the Jews? Where did they come from? What have they done in Canada? Secondly, a piece of context. The highest level of anti-Semitism, according to research, is among the most educated in the country, not the least educated. So we're talking university faculty, and we have to be concerned that university faculty are teaching students who will become university faculty and university administration in the future, and they're carrying with them their bias. Thirdly, for context, most of the anti-Semitism that we're relating to is centered on anti-Zionism, and we're not talking about that enough. We have got to know our own history of Israel and where it comes from, and that we are an Indigenous people. So we are at CAF reaching out to the Indigenous communities of Canada. We are Indigenous people. And if we are not going to talk about that, if we are going to say we arrived in, post-war, World War II, and we were refugees and therefore we should be on the land, we're missing the most important part of our story. We are not there simply because we were refugees. We, thank God, have a country to go to as refugees, but that's not why we chose that land in 1920 or 22 when it was granted to us. So we know that the Jewish community itself does not have enough education about our own history. That should be somehow mandated. I don't know how we make up for that. I have 3 kids who are millennials and they don't know the story. And so I know that it's a huge gap. We at CAF are reaching out to Christian Zionists, to Muslim reformist Muslims who want to be talking about anti-Semitism. And with our planned rally, we will be talking to the Baha'i community, the Iranian dissidents, the Chinese dissidents, those who are standing with us because of persecution they have themselves experienced, larger community, the Hindu communities, the Yazidis whom we've worked with at CAF. We need to be building bridges across faiths, creeds, race, whatever. And that's a first step because the Jewish community is very small. And as Erwin Koller said, we can't do it ourselves. It's a societal problem. It's not just a Jewish problem. So right now we're doing regular webinars. All of our webinars have been posted. We have experts to talk about all of these subjects that I'm mentioning. We have a little education committee working on developing materials for teachers to help them understand and know what anti-Semitism is, but also who are the Jews and what's the story of Israel. The number of organizations that are anti-Israel is phenomenal, and we really have to look at the source of so much of the anti-Semitism. So I would encourage also all the people that are watching to look at the organizations they're involved with, and are they actively doing something? Are they collaborating? Are they showing leadership? Are they standing up and saying we won't take it anymore, essentially, and that we want to be part of the solution? We have to be actively seeking the solution and not passive, waiting for somebody else to solve it for us.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea, so much. It's time for another poll. Now, remember, all the questions that are being posed tonight, including these rapid poll questions, will be shared with our government at the summit. Now, a reminder, make sure you're signed into the chat module on the right hand, accept the terms and click join. When the poll is active, you're going to see a vote button. Make your selection from the options that appear and we will instantly tabulate the results. So here is the next question. Has the rise in anti-Semitism caused you to consider leaving Canada? Something that would be extremely sad. I'm interested to see what the results are there. Noah, what are your thoughts on this question? And I guess, as we're waiting for the answers here, what can you say about CIJA's work to protect Jewish life and a way of life for Jews in Canada?
So, look, Canada is one of the greatest places in the world to live as a Jewish person. And I'm blessed to live in one of the greatest cities in the world to live as a Jewish person with one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in the diaspora. And we need to, now is not the time to retreat. I don't think now is the time for us not to recede from Canadian society, but to stand up, lean in, and preserve and protect what we have here because we cherish it so much. And that's exactly what tens of thousands of all of you who are on this call this evening, all of you out there who took action in calling for the government to convene this national summit, you stood up and raised your voices. We are proud Canadians. This is our home. Yeah. And whether our families have been here for more than 100 years, like mine, or whether we're newcomers who have been here only for a number of years, now's the time to lean in and take part and engage, not to run away. And I think I'm hopeful that
the poll results show that. Yes, they do. So
from our resilience as a community.
Yeah, so it's 25% say yes and 75% say no. So they're not planning to leave, which you're right. It's a very good answer because I agree. This is a wonderful place to live, and I think we're very lucky. And I know even my grandparents, who survived the Holocaust and are still alive at 103 and 95 years old, see the rise in anti-Semitism, but love Canada and love being here. So I'm glad
Naomi,
to see that.
I'll only add that the fact that a quarter of the people here said yes is something we need to pay attention to, and
for sure.
It underscores the need for government action. This is not something that any of us should accept. The fact that people feel like this is that they need to consider whether or not Canada is their home is something that cuts right to the fiber of what makes us Canadian, and we need to all come together collectively and stand against it and take action.
100%. Our next question comes from Montreal. We'll go to another video question.
Bonjour, mon nom est Michel Dahan. Comme beaucoup de Montréalais, je suis profondément préoccupé par la montée de l'antisémitisme chez nous. J'aimerais savoir qu'est-ce que nos élus ont mis en place et plus précisément, qu'est-ce que le gouvernement du Québec a fait pour répondre à cette question qui est très préoccupante. Merci.
So Ita, this is firmly in your domain. We all saw the horrifying videos threatening Jewish neighborhoods in Montreal during the recent conflict in Israel. So share some insight with us on what's going on in Quebec.
I'm going to start by responding in French. Michel, merci pour la question. C'est vrai que nous avons observé, nous avons vécu un niveau d'antisémitisme, une augmentation inquiétante. Seulement depuis le mois de janvier, entre le mois de janvier et le mois de mai, nous avons vu une augmentation d'antisémitisme qui a surpassé le taux d'incidents antisémites en 2020. Alors, ça veut dire que de janvier au mois de mai, on a déjà surpassé le nombre d'incidents qu'on a eu l'année dernière. The government of Quebec in May unanimously condemned all incidents of violence and anti-Semitism, the incredibly high, in French I was talking about the high number of incidents of anti-Semitism that we experienced in Montreal. There was a unanimous motion condemning the anti-Semitism, which was followed by the adoption of the IRA definition by the minister responsible for the fight against racism in Quebec. And these are amazing first steps. Alors, je parlais de la motion unanime par le gouvernement de Québec qui a condamné les actes de violence que nous avons vécus à Montréal. Je peux dire que moi-même, vous avez tous écouté mes enfants, vous avez tous un peu le goût de mon vécu, mais cet incident fameux où il y avait les voitures qui circulaient dans un quartier juif avec des jeunes qui cherchaient les Juifs, qui chassaient les Juifs. Moi-même, j'étais à la maison avec mes jeunes enfants. Naomi, plutôt, dans cette session, a parlé de ces enfants qui avaient peur d'afficher un Walk for Israel pancarte sur le jardin. moi-même, des enfants qui se demandaient est-ce qu'on peut sortir de la maison, est-ce qu'on peut quitter la maison sans un adulte après des mois et des mois où ils ont le droit, la permission de sortir, de se promener dans le quartier chez les amis. Alors, je comprends le vécu, nous l'avons tous vécu, mais c'est pas notre combat seul, c'est le combat des gouvernements et des législateurs, des leaders politiques, justement de mener la lutte contre l'antisémitisme. L'antisémitisme n'est pas seulement le problème de la communauté juive, ce n'est pas notre combat nous-mêmes seuls. Quand l'antisémitisme augmente, nous savons que c'est juste le début, que c'est un prédicateur à la radicalisation, que c'est la canarie dans la mine. Et nous savons que ça abîme la société. Il n'y a rien qu'à regarder partout au monde où on voit les taux inquiétants d'antisémitisme. C'est pour ça que nous avons dans le gouvernement des partenaires qui ont pris un premier pas important, mais maintenant c'est pour le futur de travailler pour justement ajouter des pas concrets qui vont justement renforcer l'éducation contre l'antisémitisme dans les écoles, dans les forces de police, et justement de continuer d'avoir des leaders politiques qui vont répéter et mener par exemple. Ce ne font pas partie de nos valeurs québécoises, ce ne font pas partie de nos valeurs canadiennes. L'antisémitisme, ni la haine, ni l'antisémitisme sont les bienvenus au Québec ou au Canada. I just went on to add that the government of Quebec, following a strong unanimous condemnation of all the incidents that we experienced in Montreal, the minister responsible for the fight against racism, Benoit Charette, just a few weeks ago announced that the government adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and that is a great tool to use in the fight against anti-Semitism. And all of these things are great steps towards making sure that anti-Semitism is not allowed to root, to fester, to take strength. We know all too well what happens. We know all too well that anti-Semitism is a is a sign of radicalization, is the canary in the mine. We know all these things about anti-Semitism. We also know that even though as Jews we feel so strongly anti-Semitism, and it's our lived experience, it's our history, but it doesn't just affect us, it affects the entire society. And when anti-Semitism is allowed to fester, it changes everything for everyone, and we just have to look around the world and see where we have alarming rates of anti-Semitism that have been allowed to grow. And it's up to governments to fight back, to ensure that there's education, sensitization against anti-Semitism, that there's an understanding of what anti-Semitism is and how to fight it, and how that affects us in the work that we do with police, for example, in Montreal. There's excellent cooperation with Federation CJA and the Montreal Police, but all of that is part of an understanding where our concerns are, where the risks are, ensuring that we're working together to protect communities. But the resources need to be available. Noah talked earlier about hate crimes units. We need to make sure that governments continue to provide the resources so that we can have hate crimes units that are more than one person and that can really deal with the mounting volume of hate incidents and anti-Semitic incidents in Quebec. And we have to fight back. We have to call it out when we see it. On n'a pas le luxe de rester tranquille, de ne pas parler, de ne pas s'exprimer, de ne pas justement condamner les actes antisémites quand ils se font. Nous avons une tendance dans la communauté juive parfois de dire ok, c'était pas tellement grave, mais il faut justement pousser contre cette vague d'antisémitisme.
Thank you so much, Ita, for all of that. I know, especially with what's going on in your house, you gave us a lot of information, so thank you very much. I want to move along here because we want to get to our next poll question, and then we want to get to some of your questions which have come in tonight. So here is the next poll question. With the recent rise in anti-Semitism, have you changed your behavior? For example, deciding not to wear a kippah or jewelry that features the Star of David when you go out. I know we heard from one of the videos earlier that they were saying that they have taken off their jewelry. Ruth, I don't know if you can comment on, a reaction from students. Maybe you've heard from people who don't want to wear kippahs around university campuses. We're going to wait for those results to come in, but maybe you can talk to us about what students have said to you.
Yeah, I think for a lot of Jewish presenting students, so Jews who do wear a kippah or tzitzit, or they wear a Star of David, there is more hesitancy to wear that kind of religious garb on campus. Keep in mind also that we were in a virtual space, especially during the recent escalation. Had we been on campus during that time, I can only imagine the level of fear and trepidation around being a Jewish presenting student on campus. And I work at York, but I don't think I'm speaking for York exclusively, as that being a general sentiment that a lot of Hillel professionals are hearing and having to help students through. And that should never be acceptable, regardless of what's going on globally or even within Canada. That should never be okay.
Yeah, I agree. We're just waiting for those poll results to come in. So as we're waiting for those, there we go. The results are yes, 39%, no, 61%. So 61% have not changed their behavior. Ruth just answered that. So Noah, do you want to talk a little bit about those poll results and what you've heard from people?
So those poll results actually mirror the results of a survey conducted by the Jewish Federations in 2018 with U of T and York that showed, U of T and York University, that showed that around 40% of Canadian Jews hide their Jewish identity when they go into in the public square, in the public sphere. And that's something that should make us all feel a little bit uncomfortable, not just a little bit uncomfortable. I wear a kippah, my sons wear kippot. It's unthinkable for me to accept taking my kippah off in Toronto, in Canada. It goes against everything that we are as a society and a country. And we need to push back against the forces that seek to make Jews check their identity at the door and to hide in plain sight. We need government and civil society to push back against this phenomenon. Whether it's a kippah, a Magen David, or one's connection with Israel, it's antithetical to Canadian values that we should feel compelled to hide here. And it's an inversion of the way things should be proceeding. We need our society to create space for us to feel comfortable in being fully who we are here as Canadians, as Jewish Canadians. And again, I'll echo what I said before. Now's the time to lean in, not to recede, and make sure that we preserve and protect the vibrant and welcoming community that we enjoy today.
Thanks so much, Noah. So getting to some of those questions that people have sent in, we've had multiple questions and comments in the chat box about anti-Semitism in the workplace, from the corporate sector to unions. We're seeing anti-Semitic harassment and exclusion. We're also seeing anti-Semitism excluded from professional training on diversity and inclusion. What is your message to members of our community who are going through this? Andrea, maybe you want to comment on this?
Well, to reiterate, I think what everybody has said tonight, which is to stand up for your rights. And so there are ways to address some of these things in the workplace, being formal complaints and sometimes just sharing of information. An HR department might not even know, as several people mentioned here, might not even have thought about anti-Semitism when they think about anti-racism and diversity training. For 40 years, I ran one of the largest charities in Canada, and we did multiracial training, multicultural training, cultural competence training, and every other form of diversity programming that was laid on us by the government. And even now, I realize that anti-Semitism never came up. It wasn't deemed to be an issue. Maybe it really wasn't for all those years, I don't know, but it never came up. So we dealt with every other minority and every other cause. And now I realize that's a missing ingredient, and it really needs to become part of the central part of the training in all of these programs. And under provincial legislation, some of these are mandated programs. There will be probably anti-racist training in every single organization of a certain size. So now is a good time for people to go proactively to talk to the department or the individuals responsible for that and try to encourage it to be part of the setting. In terms of how unions behave, obviously there are mechanisms for bringing grievances, and I think that needs to be dealt with. with. There's some historical cases in Canada, some of you might remember, where Cup W, which is the postal workers, has had an anti-Israel stance for a long time and was distributing information, and Jewish postal workers felt intimidated and had no place to go. So there needs to be a cognizance of these issues, and we outside of the unions need to take issue with what's going on inside the unions. The major funder of the BDS coalition in Canada, the major funders are the unions and the United Church. And so we need to be proactively confronting this. It is not acceptable. Even if they want to partner with unions in the disputed territories and say that's the reason, it's not acceptable to isolate Jewish workers within any of their settings. So again, I think we need to be far more proactive, call it out, name it, shame it. We can't ignore it. And I think, again, for so long, we've just thought it was small enough, it would go away, it would fade into the distance, but it's not okay.
Thank you, Andrea. I want to move on here so we can get these questions in. Another question, we're tracking several questions actually about media bias when it comes to the Jewish community in Israel. Many were concerned about the misleading or one-sided coverage of the recent conflict in May, where members of our community were demonized for their affiliation with Israel. When does legitimate criticism of Israel cross over into hate, and what can be done to combat bias in the media? Ruth, maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. I think the question of whether legitimate criticism crosses over into anti-Semitic rhetoric really kind of loops us back to like the more broad conversation, to echo what a lot of the panelists are saying around education. It should not strictly be the Jewish community's duty to educate other communities about anti-Semitism, but given the fact that no other group seems to be picking up the baton, it is our responsibility to make those efforts central. And the best answer to this question is to be proactive so that we're not having to react to when there is media coverage that is anti-Semitic. And then that's already out there and it's online and it's already been seen by so many people. And so all of these institutions that are on this call, what I've been so impressed by is they have said, let's be proactive, let's focus on education, let's focus on disseminating what is and isn't so that we can make sure that things like this doesn't happen online. And we have seen it's already started.
Thank you so much. There's been a very active chat and we've had a lot of questions come in. So just a reminder that if we didn't get to your questions, don't worry. We're going to download a transcript of the questions to inform our work as we engage with the government at next week's Emergency Summit on Anti-Semitism. So if we didn't get to your question, not to worry. Now, before we say goodnight, I'd like to welcome Shimon Koffler-Fogel, President and CEO of CJA, to tell us a bit about what we can expect from the Emergency National Summit on Anti-Semitism and what we can expect from CJA and community leadership in the days that follow. It's been a journey to get here. I think we all realize that this is the start of a very important discussion, which will include an opportunity for all of us to contribute to helping the government realize some of the proposals that Special Envoy Kotler mentioned at the beginning. So Shimon, maybe you can give us a little bit of insight into what's going to be happening.
Naomi, first, let me thank you for joining us tonight and so ably navigating through the town hall. Your help and support's really very much appreciated. I'm mindful of the hour, Naomi, and even though I'm not used to being on mute, and I don't know how you managed to keep me on mute for an hour and a half, let me limit my remarks to just 4 very brief points. First, I do want to say and express thanks to everybody who joined this call, everybody who participated in the survey, everybody who, as Noah put it, leaned in and is unwilling to be passive in the face of the hatred directed towards our community. On behalf of our national co-chairs, Joel Reitman, Jeff Rosenthal, and indeed the federations across the country who are our principal stakeholders, the support that they've extended to us to lead in this work is enormously appreciated. And I just didn't want the evening to pass without acknowledging that really unique and oversized contribution that they make to Jewish life in Canada. before turning to the summit, I think that it's important for us to reflect on the way in which anti-Semitism or hatred directed towards the Jews is differentiated from all other forms of racism. Not that we should at all be dismissive of the challenges faced by racialized communities, communities of color, of different ethnic groups, of different faith communities. But what distinguishes the challenges that we face is that we get it from all sides. So we get it from the extreme right. We get it increasingly from the left or the very progressive side that, in reference to Andrea's comment about critical race theory, are advancing a paradigm that actually seeks to embed conflict rather than to resolve conflict. And we get it from segments of the Muslim community too. In all respects, I think that the answer has really been echoed by all of our panelists, namely that we have to move into the space. We have to challenge where necessary. We have to educate where the opportunity exists. But what we cannot do is surrender. And we cannot be passive. And I'll come back to this in just a moment. But let me turn for the next point to the issue of the summit. From the very beginning, and I want to acknowledge the tremendous support and help that we've received, not only from Minister Chagger, but from her staff, who've worked tirelessly on a very compressed schedule to get us to the point that we need to be for next week. So hats off to all of the work that they've put into this. And needless to say, the contribution of Erwin Kotler is just outsized. He's just an extraordinary human being, an advocate both for our own community as well as all of those who are suffering from discrimination and intolerance. From the very outset, Naomi, the goal was not for us to consume all the oxygen at the summit, but rather for it to be a platform on which all levels of government identified and addressed the challenge of anti-Semitism and the ways in which they were going to be able to contribute to moving the dial on it, pushing it back into the corner, addressing some of the challenges. And that's really the way this has been organized. So the value of this exercise tonight is especially important because it's going to inform the way in which our political leadership at all levels of government next week will be responding to and putting forward recommendations with respect to how we confront the different challenges related to anti-Semitism. And for us, there's been a really fascinating alignment between the kind of comments that we heard tonight, Naomi, and the government's thinking in terms of how to organize a response to the challenges of anti-Semitism. So the focus next week will be specifically on the areas of security and public safety, on education, and more broadly on civil society, issues of inclusion, of acceptance, of not erasing or invalidating or delegitimizing the Jewish lived experience. What we're looking for in a very practical sense, and Noah touched on some of these things in an earlier response, was we want the capacity to take increased ownership of our own institutional and community safety and security. We don't want to work in place of police. We want to work along with and under the direction of law enforcement. And there are models that have been undertaken and developed in different parts of the world over the years that could really serve to guide us on how the Jewish community can adopt a community security trust kind of approach that really gives us a sense that we are part of the solution. And that we are taking a firm and principled stand in defending the physical security of our institutions, of our communities, and working hand in hand with law enforcement to ensure that everybody has a high level of confidence that they can go out with a kippah or with a Star of David necklace, or that they can carry an Israeli flag. So that's element number one. Element number two, and again, your panelists touched on this, is the whole issue of social media literacy. We have come to rely on social media as a vital and integral part of our daily lives, but it has the dark side that has given expression to toxic anti-Semitism as well as hates of all sorts. And what we need to do is undertake a national campaign that is going to enhance social media literacy so people can better appreciate responsible use of social media, the dangers of the abuse of social media, and the ways in which we can all contribute to making it a safer place and forum or venue for people to engage with each other. We spoke about the education, we spoke about social media literacy, we spoke about security. Those are the kind of things that we want to see. But what's most important, Naomi, is that we see that all levels of government are working together, because the jurisdictional authority for many of these things falls to different levels of government. And if we don't have them working together, then it will be really challenging for us to move forward. So one of the outcomes that we want to see from next week's summit is an expression of resolve on the part of all levels of government, and there will be participation from all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, that they are committed to working together, to working with us in order to move forward and push back against anti-Semitism. But the final thought that I have for you, Naomi, and I'd like to share with all of our viewers is this. And both Erwin Kotler touched on it, as well as some of our panelists. The summit is not the end of the process. If anything, it is simply the beginning. And what it can do is really provide us with the tools to empower us to work with all levels of government and civil society to move forward in confronting the challenges of anti-Semitism. We are going to have to put our nose to the grindstone over the coming weeks and months and even years in order to ensure the implementation of all of the initiatives and plans. And we are going to urgently need the participation, the engagement, and the leadership of the community across the country in order to make this a reality. Tonight's a great beginning. It's going to help inform the discussion next week. Next week is an important milestone, an unprecedented event where a summit has been convened by the national government in order to address hate directed against a particular community. We're gratified that there will be a similar exercise for Muslim Canadians who themselves face a range of particular challenges that really require a solution to be reflected in efforts on the part of all of us. And the government's anti-racism secretariat has done some really important work and requires the support and cooperation of all elements of Canadian society to make this the kind of place that we all want it to be. So Naomi, thank you. And through you, thank you to everybody who joined tonight. You will hear more from us. You will hear from us. You will hear from our colleagues, those that are part of the Must Speak coalition of organizations fighting anti-Semitism, as well as those that Naomi mentioned earlier, B'nai B'rith, Simon Wiesenthal, other organizations that have done some really, really important and powerful work. We will together defeat this. And tonight is an important start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shimon. And as you said, an unprecedented event, and it's really unfortunate that we have to have this happening, but I think this is a great start and a truly important conversation that we've had here. Thank you so much to our panelists for your insight and for the work that you do every single day in making Canada a better country for Jews and for all of our neighbors. I know we all hope that we could probably have joined together in person, but I think it's beautiful that we're still together here virtually and really coming together all across the country for this. So, you know, the virtual, I think we're all used to the virtual thing now, but it really does have the ability to bring us together all across the country. This has been an enlightening program, and most of all, I want to thank all of you who joined us tonight, and to those who submitted questions and who raised your concerns. CJA staff will be reviewing all the comments and questions that we didn't have time to discuss tonight, and will be following up extensively in the weeks to come. To stay connected, follow CJA on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and if you haven't already, please visit cja.ca and join CJA's mailing list. Again, a really important start, as Shimon said. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we'll keep you updated as to what happens next week. Thank you again.